Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. The early game in RPGs is extremely important for multiple reasons. The first impressions of the game you're playing is the most obvious reason. After a couple of hours in the early game, you'll probably have a clear picture of the experience which that particular game has to offer, and then you decide if you want to continue it or not. This comes down to the personal preference and your expectations from the game, so it can be really subjective. I am more interested in the general quality of features that the game offers and how it presents those features. And that's a big emphasis on how. Let's take tutorials as an example. There is nothing wrong with tutorials in the beginning of the game as long as they don't overstay their welcome. I prefer to have some basic instructions for the core mechanics and to discover everything else by myself. I believe this kind of approach to game design is far superior than relying on heavy hand-holding tutorials. Simply because the game can easily lose the sense of mystery and discovery if it's trying so hard to explain every single feature it has. When this is the case, I either think that the game is intended for a much younger audience, or they could be afraid that you won't get to experience something they worked on really hard, or the developers are not expecting you to be smart enough to figure it out by yourself. Whatever the case might be, I prefer when the game trusts you to figure some things out by yourself. Even if there is a chance that you might miss something entirely. There are a lot of people who finish Dark Souls without even knowing that parry mechanic is even a thing, and I'm willing to bet that something similar happened to you at least once with some RPG. When this happens, you can be either impressed because you found another potential way to play the game and another reason to come back to it, or disappointed because you think that the game has poorly explained features, or you just don't care. That's an option as well. But if you're a developer who thinks outside the box, even the tutorials could be a fun experience. The White Orchard from The Witcher 3 would be a great example. This whole beginning area is basically one big tutorial, but you might not even notice that because of the way it's presented. All major features of The Witcher 3 can be experienced here, but only if you wish to. Besides the main quest, you have a Witcher contract, interesting side quests and treasure hunts. But nothing is in your face, it's subtle and optional, and it can give you a good idea of what you can expect from the game in general. You can leave the White Orchard as soon as possible by only following the main quest if you wish to. And the main quest itself tries to show you that not everything is black and white, but a lot of shades of grey. And that's something you should realize as fast as possible, because it might serve you well in the future. Another game with a great tutorial area is Divinity Original Sin 2. Fort Joy is an amazing starting location, which also acts like a big tutorial. The pacing of the story and the gameplay is done so well on this island, and considering the amount of different ways to play this game, that's really impressive. By the time you manage to leave this island, you will feel a great sense of accomplishment, which is not something that every RPG can pull off so easily. The early game in Original Sin 2 can grip you really hard, even if you're not a huge fan of this genre. What's fascinating about this game is the turn-based combat system that manages to be appealing to people who don't even like this kind of combat. And to be completely honest, I am one of those people. But it's not only the combat that stands out, of course. The great exploration with lots of secrets to be found, strong role-playing features, a good sense of character progression, and like I already said, great pacing all around. You can finish the first chapter of the game in multiple ways, around 10 if I'm not mistaken. I don't know about you guys, but that's another thing that I hold in high regard when it comes to RPGs. Having multiple options while doing a quest is the main thing that makes your choices feel meaningful. Not to mention that it also adds to the replay value. Another really important thing when it comes to the early game is the sense of character progression. Now of course, this is important in general, but especially in the early game. I talked about this specific topic in a couple of my videos, and you can check that out if you're interested. It's really satisfying when you feel that your character is getting stronger in an RPG. If a game doesn't set a strong foundation for progression early on, the chances for it to improve later in the game are really slim. Of course, this will vary from game to game, and a lot of factors are involved, like the leveling system, scaling, enemy placement, story structure, and just the world building in general. I really don't want to go in depth with the progression, because it's a large spectrum of things. My point is, the steady growth of your character's power in the early game, driven by the well-paced narrative and the gameplay, is really important to implement as best as possible. If there are some large inconsistencies with the progression, like a sudden power growth or the lack of power growth, you might get the feeling that the game is all over the place. which is definitely not something you want to experience in the early game or the game in general. Anyway, instead of rambling without context, here is another example of an RPG that has a great early game in my opinion. Gothic 2 is a game that I usually mention a lot on this channel when it comes to RPG discussions. Basically everything that I mentioned about Divinity Original Sin 2 can be said about this game as well. The majority of people who played this game can easily agree that it's one of the best action RPGs ever made. The early game in Gothic 2 sets the game up almost perfectly. You have an interesting and easy to follow narrative with a clear goal, and then the game lets you discover how things and people work in this world. Right from the start, you have more than a few ways of approaching different gameplay situations, and finding them is just a matter of your curiosity. You have around 8 different methods of entering the first city, which is crazy when you think about it. And the game continues to offer you more than a few options to complete different quests and make important decisions. The sense of progression is amazing, even though the combat can be really hard to get used to. But once you figure out how the combo system works, it becomes much easier to deal with. And yeah, sure, for today's standards it's definitely outdated, but if you don't have a problem with that, you can still appreciate the gameplay. The first chapter of the game has so much stuff to do, it can be almost overwhelming. The whole game has a huge replay value, but especially the first chapter. Now, after all of this, you should have a clear idea of what I'm looking for when it comes to the early game in RPGs, but here's a summary anyway. Less aggressive tutorials and more creative way of introducing the player to the game world and mechanics, multiple ways of approaching and solving quests, a narrative that's not overwhelming the player right from the beginning, and a solid character progression system. Obviously, the combat is very important as well, but I'm willing to overlook some flaws in general if the game has all the stuff I mentioned. It's not a lot to ask for, right? These are just my opinions of course, and I would like to hear yours in the comments below. Which RPG has the best early game in your opinion and why? Don't forget to check out my other videos about various RPG discussions. If you enjoyed this video, a like would be highly appreciated. Don't forget to subscribe for more content and click on the bell icon so you don't miss any future uploads. Special thanks to my Patreons, and if you as well want to become one of them, all the links are in the description. Patreon is definitely the best place to directly support my work, and every contribution is highly appreciated. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.